You said there's 200 in here? Ish.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. If you'd like to, though, we'd love to know where you're joining from. So if you'll introduce yourself in the chat and tell us who you are and where you're from, that'd be great. Thanks.
Oh, Stephanie's here.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Looks like we have some great representation. Thank y'all for being here today. So my name is Lacey Hensley, and I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today we have Dr. David Scott, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But before then, just a couple of tips. We encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'll be helping Dr. Scott monitor that today. Also, feel free to use the chat. We definitely want audience participation as well. So a little bit of background about ICCR before we get started. The Institute for Coordinated Community Response began and was created in 2018 as a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. ICCR is a training and technical assistance program whose mission is to work alongside rural communities to improve their collaborative systemic response to domestic violence. We do host monthly webinars like today's webinar, and even though we try to gear towards rural practitioners, we also, all of our trainings are centered around the unique needs of all practitioners in the domestic violence field. So we do highlight unique needs of rural communities, but can be practical skills for all practitioners involved. So thank you for being here today and for your dedication to improving your own community's domestic violence response. You can learn more about ICCR on our website, instituteccr.org. I encourage you to sign up for our e-blast to stay in the loop about all the great trainings that we have provided throughout the year, especially our roll call trainings, if you've not checked out our roll call trainings. So now on to today's presentation. I'd like to take a minute and introduce you to today's speaker. Dr. David Scott earned his PhD in Public Affairs in 2010 from the University of Texas at Dallas in Richardson, Texas. He holds 4 master's degrees and working on what, a 5th? Is that right? Oh my goodness, that's so master's in industrial management, business administration, criminal justice, and public administration, all from UT Tyler, and currently working on his master's in cybersecurity and risk management. Dr. Scott was a public policy coordinator for the Texas Council on Family Violence, overseeing the development and funding with the domestic violence high-risk teams program with the Office of the Attorney General and Criminal Justice Division of Texas, and providing input during the Texas legislative sessions in both the Texas House and Senate on a number of criminal justice related bills pertaining to domestic violence, sexual assault, orders of protection, and firearms. Dr. Scott served in the Longview Police Department from 2003 to 2015. So Dr. Scott is a friend of ICCR and the conference. And so take it away. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be here. Thank you all for having me. Let me start by sharing my screen first. All right. Give me 1 second. All right. All right. How's that look?
Looks great.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming on a Tuesday afternoon. I hope wherever you are, you're in air conditioning because it's still 105 out where I'm here in Tyler right now. I did see some people from all over Texas and from Chicago and Oklahoma, so it's really good to see you guys in this space just for this little presentation. So today, what I'm going to be doing is discussing on best practices on creating stability with high-risk interpersonal violence interventions or teams with using risk assessments kind of at the cornerstone. And one of the gaps we found in the research that I'm going to just talk about at the beginning is how we need to focus on serving more of the rural areas or the areas outside the metropolitan and urban areas, just for a few slides, and then kind of tie all that together and just present basically what I call is a way, not the way to do things. So please don't think this is the gospel according to Dr. David Scott. It is simply things that I've encountered when I was working with the Texas Council on Family Violence, things I'm doing now, and things I've seen during my career in law enforcement and in academics. So we'll get started here. So again, my name is David Scott. I am currently an associate professor at the University of Texas at Tyler. We are in East Texas. I'm part of the UT system. Primarily, I teach mostly criminal justice, but as Lacey said, I do have a background in public administration, and I do a lot of consulting work with ICCR, the Office of Violence Against Women. I've done work with the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, mostly training on domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, human trafficking, and so forth. So what I'm going to do today is kind of give us an idea of how we could be thinking a little bit differently when we're trying to seek out, adopt, implement, train on, and with the risk assessment. And I'm not going to basically say this is the one to use or this is not the one to use or whatever, because just like in Texas, we have 254 counties in the state of Texas doing essentially 254 different ways of working and interdicting with domestic violence, trafficking, and so forth. So what I like to do is just kind of throw it out there. And as I'm talking, I know we've got the chat box going. In fact, I'm going to have Lacey monitor that. But if you have a question or want to say something, just put your hand up or unmute yourself, whatever. It's not going to interrupt me. I like to create a dialogue here because if there's something you're doing that's working, I would love to hear about it. But more importantly, I want to hear about some of the trials and tribulations you're having right now, because I promise you, when we start talking about it, we're going to find out we're not alone in this, that we all have problems with building teams, sustaining teams, working past a grant after the grant's expired, getting commissioners and city council and city managers and mayors to sign on to a project that's working. You have people who are rotating off the team all the time and things are changing. So I'm going to kind of talk about all of that, but basically at the center of it, I'm going to really stress that the risk assessment, whichever one you're using, is going to kind of be the hallmark or the cornerstone of everything we do with high risk or high lethality domestic violence. Okay, so right here, I am going to ask you guys to participate in a little survey. As it stands today, I'd like you to select the number that best identifies your IPV or your team in the chat box. One being you're on the brink of folding, you have no idea what's going on, to number 5, excellent, meeting goals. 3, you're neutral, you're good, but not great. You could always be doing better. So if you would just take a second, throw a number in there. And I promise you, I'm not going to run back to your boss or your counsel and say, hey, so-and-so said this, but just to get an idea of where we are, because, 1 week we're doing great. The next week we're not doing so hot. Quarters change with funding. executive directors, coordinators, people change hats all the time, but I would just want to kind of see how we're doing. And I am actually going to see if I can, no, I can't. So Lacey, you're
Looks
going
like it's mainly 3s and 4s.
Okay, good. All right. So either we're doing something really well or we're just afraid to talk about it, which is totally fine. That's cool. Okay, that number's still growing. Well, good. Keep an eye on that. Okay. So today what I'm going to talk about is we just did introductions, so I'm a little bit ahead of myself, which is good. We're going to discuss the landscape and resources in both rural and metropolitan areas. I'm going to focus on risk assessments that are the key to this entire presentation and arguably the key to success with all your IPVs. We're going to talk about, instead of building a program, rather create an intelligence network where you are sharing information, you're doing stuff with actionable intelligence, and you're making decisions based on that information or that intelligence. And instead of just kind of playing email tag or phone tag and meeting, sporadically, things are just going to kind of basically be kind of fluid, and the information's flowing back and forth. And what I like to say in all my presentations is that the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. We're going to talk about how we share information because it's important, especially with the risk assessments, because they're changing all the time. And we're going to talk about the frequency of risk assessments and how important they are to be continuously using them, even with the same client. And then I'm going to pull it all together with talking about sustainment or sustaining your program with the risk assessments at the core of your organization or your program. All right, so first we're going to talk about rural areas and rural communities and what it looks like with IPVs. Now, when I started this a few months ago, when Lacey first approached me about, we really need to be looking at rural areas and we need to be talking about some of the areas that are more sparsely populated, I said, hey, that's great, no problem. I'm a researcher. I'm going to go out there and do it. And I've got access to all the recent criminal justice journals, and they are scarce. There's research out there dealing with domestic violence. There's research in rural areas. There is a little bit of research talking about risk assessments with rural areas, but there's not a whole lot. So I think I found about maybe 20 or 30 articles in the last decade that I was able to pull from and really read and try to find the gaps in the research and try to figure out, okay, what are we doing right here? And what are we doing wrong? And what really are things we hadn't considered. So I kind of want to just spend the next just couple minutes and not go down memory lane or anything like that, but give you just kind of an overview of what rural domestic violence looks like, give you some current statistics. So for those of you that might be serving areas that are rural or actually in the middle of a rural area, can bring some information back to you, or perhaps if you want to elaborate on stuff that's going on out there, that would really be appreciative. So as it stands today, what does rural look like in terms of domestic violence? Well, rural companies comprise of about 28% of the nation's population. And with regards to domestic violence, research is revealing the following. Number one, even though we're in 2023 and we're after, COVID and COVID-19 and all that, we still today have limited access to services. And that's domestic violence, that's services, that's advocacy, that's shelters, that even might be medical facilities. It could be a SANE nurse. It could be child protective services working with kids and stuff like that, just because it's just, so sparsely populated. They did research on lower education literacy rates, and this is across the nation. This is not in anyone's particular backyard. The norms and attitudes of tolerance toward domestic violence, we have to look at isolation and pockets of poverty. We look at increased alcoholism and narcotics use. Of course, the geographic and social isolation is a constant. And then there's also a lack of public transportation. I mean, they don't have city buses. They don't have Ubers out there. They don't have taxi cabs and all that in many of these areas. So it's something we need to think about when we're working with our clients is, if they can get away, great, but how are they going to get away? If there's one car and the abuser has that car, or if they have a car, where are they going to go if there's no family or access to resources in their area? Looking at the isolation factors, they may serve as a barrier to the safety of the domestic violence client. There's also a fear of disclosure and community response that may isolate the victim even further. And again, I'm not telling you something you don't already know, but these are constant concerns that came up in the literature that I think we know they're there. And my question is what are we doing about it? What steps are we taking to curve this down or just completely fix it? When we look at the poverty level, there is limited employment in a lot of these areas. A lot of them don't have insurance, or they're underinsured or not insured at all. Some of these folks don't have childcare, or they're using family, or one staying home, the other one's working, or they're working opposite shifts to take care of children. And then there's limited housing opportunities. If somebody wants to just leave themselves, or they have children, or they have a special circumstance, where are they going to go? All right. I worked in an area not a couple of years ago where from the downtown center of this particular site, the nearest shelter was 40 or 45 miles away from the police department. So, for me, I grew up in, I'm from Houston, but I was born in Chicago. I grew up in the Houston area. Even in East Texas, we're not completely in the sticks. I mean, I have a city that's over 100,000 people. I can be anywhere in 10 minutes. I mean, we have a police department, we have our courts, we have our advocates, and we have our shelters, all within pretty close distance of each other. But having to find someone who may or may not have a vehicle, having to go 40 or 45 plus miles or get a ride, and then get out there and can only stay, X amount of days or X amount of time, it's still kind of mind blowing that we still have these hurdles in 2023. From the rural perpetrators of domestic violence are twice as likely to cause severe physical injuries to their victims as well as use a weapon on their victims compared to urban perpetrators. I found that in a couple of journals when I was doing some trolling a few weeks ago. Twice as many rural perpetrators threaten to kill their victims compared to urban perpetrators. Rural victims are more likely to experience multiple instances of abuse before requesting orders of protection compared to urban victims. And these were all surveys that were done, in 2005, 2006, 2022, and so forth. And these numbers and these reports remain consistent in all these studies. Scholars estimate that between 10 and 40% of adolescents who experienced physical and sexual ADV, while up to 70% had experienced psychological consequences or threatening forms of ADV. Now, what we're talking about here is we're looking at the violent men in rural communities are more likely to be protected by some of those good old boy networks. And I really, when I went there, my mind went straight to Dukes of Hazzard and all these other shows that I grew up watching in TV when I was younger. And it kind of got me thinking where this still goes on. We still have a lot of the good old boys. We still have pockets of these. Well, the husband's the breadwinner, and the husband, he's working, or he may even be working as a reserve officer or somewhere in the government or something like that, where it's virtually impossible for someone to basically break free or break away safely in these situations. There's also the patriarchal male peer support, defined as the attachment to male peers and the resources they provided that encourage legitimate woman abuse. And these were in 2 studies I found. And what was interesting there was, we still have pockets of our culture and in different communities where, you have that patriarchy rule. You have those customs and norms where it's just been generation after generation after generation. And for someone to go in and try to break those chains or break that way of thinking, it's an uphill battle. If you're outside looking in, or if you're somebody trying to break away from an abuser who is like a 3rd, 4th generation of this kind of mindset, that's an obstacle. That's a barrier. So, we have, I think sometimes in the metropolitan urban areas, we kind of take things for granted, even though, yes, we have limited resources. We have, breakdowns in communication. Our models aren't perfect. But, looking further out into more of these rural areas, all the research suggests that they are twice as likely to experience the trials and tribulations that we're experiencing in the urban area. So getting off the rural area for just a minute, just a show of hands or thumbs up or just yes, who operates like this and this from time to time with your own or his or her IPV, where things are going well and then all of a sudden things go sideways or they go to hell in a handbasket, but it's basically a dumpster fire. It is basically, things are up and down and you go to work, there we go. People are raising hands left and right here. I love this. It's just every day. You just don't know what fire you want to put out first. You don't know what the hell's going on. You're trying to find your client. You're trying to get people on board to basically say, hey, we need to find this client. We need to get this risk assessment done. When is this case going to trial? This person's violated the fourth protective order in a row, and we need to get him hooked up, but we can't find him, and there's no officers available, or the victim's gone underground and stuff like that. That is normal for this line of work. Okay. And I actually have this dumpster as one of my old screensavers because it just depended on my day. What fire I needed to put out first. And this is before I had my third cup of coffee, by 6 a.m. You're not alone. That's the good thing. You're not alone in this universe. Everyone has this dumpster fire going on in some form or fashion in their organization. So that brings me to the crux of this presentation. And we're going to talk about why the risk assessment. Why is the risk assessment so important? Why is it basically the cornerstone of everything we should be doing with high risk and high lethality? Well, there's a couple of things here I want to just talk about first before going into my entire presentation here. Is that number one, it provides a summary of the incident or assault. Okay, now I'm a former police officer. I was a patrol sergeant and then a sergeant in CID. And we started touching and looking at risk assessments. And then when I went to work for the Texas Council of Family Violence, risk assessments became like the cornerstone of everything I was doing when we were building domestic violence high-risk teams. And I started really focusing my research, both professionally and academically, on DV, high risk, and risk assessments. And what the risk assessment does from a third party is it basically provides a summary of what happened at that particular time to the client or the victim. All right, where she said yes, where he or she checked the boxes, the scores. That is something that is just a documentation that law enforcement or a hotline or an advocate was contacted. They went out there, they asked them a series of questions, and then after that, we got an idea of exactly the level of lethality, what the victim was reporting and experiencing at the time, and now we need to do something with that information. But it does clarify and gives context to what happened. And this is a tool that just details the level of perceived danger by the victim to authorities or to a representative outside of the home at the time of contact. So I know there are a dozen risk assessments out there. When I started really getting into this, there were basically four. Let me go to my next slide. I hope you all like my little thing here. There you go. Okay. So we had the danger assessment, the LAP, the DALE, and the ODARA. I don't have the ODARA on here simply because this is a three-sided dice. I apologize for that. But when I saw this, I get excited. I'm kind of a research nerd and I kind of like using special graphics. So if y'all like this, just give me a smiley face or hands up. And if you want to know how I did it, I'll send you the information. But these are the big risk assessments. When I went across Texas, I went into Oklahoma, I'm looking at Louisiana. I know some of these guys are using these in Chicago right now, or Illinois. These are the big 3 or 4 that we use. Now, instead of me giving you the historical background and the definitions of all of them, and all of us in this space, I think, are pretty much familiar with the risk assessments and where they come from and how they evolved. I kind of wanted to create this little slide right here to just give you a summary of how they're scored. So at the top, we have the lethality assessment protocol, the LAP. When we're using this tool in the field, it's, questions 1 through 3 are answered yes, automatic, we're good to go. If they respond after that through questions 4, 11, we add up those questions. They fall into different degrees of perceived lethality or high risk. And this can also be officer triggered, meaning what I love about this one is if an officer, and I've been there, and those of you that have experienced this, feel free to give me a thumbs up or an amen. We get there too quickly, or we get there at the apex of the emotion, and they're in shock, they're traumatized, they're in cognitive shutdown, and they can't answer anything, or they don't want to answer anything, or we think they're being evasive because they're just terrified for their lives, and because the suspect or the suspect's family or a third party belonging to that suspect's in earshot. So they just want us out of their lives. They want us to kind of come in, restore the peace, do what we need to do, but they don't want to answer any questions. This is a good way for the officer to say, I got there, there's something wrong, we need to further investigate this. So it's an officer triggered protocol. The next one is the danger assessment. And after scoring up those questions, and I believe there's 20 questions on there, and every question has a different weight, they have like 4 categories of danger in this tool. One is there's some danger, which is a score of less than 8, increased danger, which is 8 to 13, severe danger is a score between 14 and 18, and then extreme danger is a score of greater than 18. In those questions, they ask about, past history of assault, access to using a firearm. They ask about, alcohol and if the victim was pregnant, did the suspect know they were pregnant, stuff like that. All great questions. And we're going to talk more about that just in a minute. The other one is the Ontario Risk Assessment, which is the one from the ODARA. Some of us are very familiar with that. And it has a score of 0 to 6 and 7 to 13. And that kind of how it differentiates future predictions of the probability that the offender will commit an offense again. My point is, regardless of what they're using something. And they're basically focusing on whether what the score is or the level of perceived danger at the time that activates the IPV. And that's why the risk assessment is so important when we're doing our work. Now, another thing I've seen is a lot of agencies use just the one risk assessment for team activation, and then there's no other follow-ups with risk assessment tools. That's kind of like a one and done deal or a one-shot deal. I'm willing to argue here that when we move forward, that each interaction, each time we talk to the client, a risk assessment needs to be done for that contact. And I'm going to tell you why in just a minute here. So a lot of us are familiar with the danger assessment here. And this came from Jacqueline Campbell. I'm a big fan of this. I'm a big fan of her research. I don't think there's anything she hasn't published I haven't read yet or referenced in my own work. But these are the standard questions we asked. And the next one we have the lab. And these are the 11 questions I just talked about. And a lot of, if you guys are familiar with this, 2 things. Number one, they're on the internet. You can go to their websites and you can, take the training. With that, before you start grabbing one of these and start using it, number one, don't do that. Number 2, get the training. Understand why these questions were selected, what these questions represent, the weight of each of these questions, and how to use these tools properly. I've had some agencies in the past that they adopted a risk assessment and they started using it, and then I was called in to help build like a DVHRT or do some consulting work or teach a family violence or sexual assault course. And then I ask them about their training and they look at me and they say, what training? And I'm like, whoa, hold it, stop, put the brakes on. Where did you get this tool? And, you're using it and it's, widespread. And they said, well, we needed something and we started devising this stuff up. And I'm like, you need to slow down and really understand how to use these tools, because it can become problematic when it comes time to go to trial. And we've seen that happen several times where an agency will get excited, they'll grab a tool, they'll start using it. And one of those questions that the defense will ask is, well, where did you get your training? Or did you run all your officers through this training? And are they all certified to use it? And that could become problematic down the road at trial when you're trying to, do something with these tools and when you're trying to help a victim. So that's just my free advice right there. My contention with this is when you're using a risk assessment, it is not a one and done deal. So when I look at an offense report, there's several things I want to see besides the assault here, ag assault here, the sexual assault, the burglary of habitation. Each and every interaction with your client or victim is an opportunity to keep building on the risk assessments, to give a juror, to give the team a complete picture as the level of violence and the ongoing violence beyond the elements of the crime in a police report. So when I see this, I'm going through the report, I should see multiple assessments. It shouldn't just be one and done. All right. It should be several of these, different dates, different times, different answers. But what we're going to learn to do is we're going to pull all this together. And this is going to basically be the fuel for your fire for your IPV. Now, before risk assessments, things were pretty basic for law enforcement. Okay. And we would ask those basic questions, the elements of the crime, the who, the what, the where, the when. How's this happened before? Did you feel any pain? Do you want a protective order? It basically looked like a child's portrait. Okay, we got some crayons, we made some coloring, we tried to write a picture of what we were doing, And, that was all we knew. We didn't have any training on risk assessments. We really didn't know what risk assessments were. And we really didn't know how they could be utilized for law enforcement. When we got a little smarter, we got some training, we started sharing the information. We went from that child's picture to this, okay? This is a much better work of art where we started asking these questions about firearms. Were they used pointed or were they used in a threatening manner towards the victim? Were you strangled or choked during the altercation? Were children present? Was the victim pregnant? Did the suspect know the victim was pregnant at the time? Was the actor suicidal or make threats of suicide? Had you left the victim recently, that would create separation violence? In other words, were you being harassed or stalked? Has he ever threatened to kill you? And did you believe that person had the ability to carry out that threat at the time they said it? Other things we look at, narcotics and alcohol abuse now and in the past. Were there any controlling issues? Was he, controlling your issues, like denying you money, following you throughout the day, basically making it impossible for you to live your life? Stalking behavior again. Were there any past physical violence situations where you didn't call the police? You handled it yourself, you kept it inside, you didn't tell anyone? What about sexual assault and ongoing harassment? And these are the big categories that we ask in all of our risk assessments. But when we started to ask these questions, we got a better work of art, a better picture of the things we needed to be asking to maximize safety and give us a direction in which we're going to basically provide the maximum safety we can for a victim. So the end result of the risk assessment is that it gave us better direction on how to do our job and to give them better, better sense of trust from a group of individuals who were total strangers, who were basically promising that we're going to try to keep you safe. We're going to get your protective order. We're going to hold the offender accountable. We're going to try to get you victim compensation. We're going to try to get you to a safe place so you can restart or rebuild your life. During all this time of chaos and anarchy, these risk assessments pretty much was just a self-diagnosis of the problems that were ailing the client at the time. Now, as much as risk assessments sound and as great as they are, we need to do a quick reality check on them. All right. Number one, this is a tool. All right. It is not a magic bullet. It is not going to cure everything. It's not going to solve the crime. It is not going to magically make everything just disappear. It is something that we can use to kind of check the pulse or check the temperature of what's going on and use it as a tool to determine if we have a high risk or high lethality situation going on here that would activate or basically have the case accepted by an IPV organization or team. The second part is implementation that's been reported has been difficult by IPV teams in the past. All right, we go in there, and one of my jobs was, we would have some funding, people would apply. And one of the things would be like, well, we have a team, we have a good idea, we're writing a mission, we're writing some goals and objectives, but we're having a hard time deciding on which risk assessment to use because our prosecution wants to use one, our advocates use another, law enforcement doesn't want to use one at all, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. Eventually, we have to flesh that out, and then we have to train everyone on, hopefully to use just one particular risk assessment. And then we have to have the buy-in. Just because I'm giving somebody training on it doesn't mean they're going to use it, doesn't mean they're going to use it appropriately or consistently across the board. So just a show of hands here, I'm going to ask you guys, I told you this is going to be interactive here. In the text, or in the chat, rather, in the chat, what do you suppose are the two biggest obstacles when we're trying to adopt and implement a risk assessment? If you had to guess. Lisa, you're gonna have to tell me some of these answers. I can't bring them up.
Yeah, everyone agreeing, compliance, cost of training, money and collaboration, confidentiality. Victim might not be honest, accurate information, using it, confidentiality restrictions and understanding, keeping it intentional, sustainability, having you use the results without understanding the tool, trust, honesty, cost and confidentiality. Victims are so traumatized they don't always remember or understand how much danger they're really in. Time and coordinated responses, resistance to implementing something new and different.
All right. So I heard resistance and change, and you guys are 110% right. All right. We hate change, but more importantly, we hate the way things are. I have just defined every police officer in the world right there. We don't like change, but we're miserable. Don't change it. How many would y'all agree with that? How many guys would say you work in organizations like that?
Lots of yeses.
All right, cool. I'm connecting with them. Great. Okay. So change is inevitable. Let me tell you that right now. And we need to change. And the risk assessment it can be a big change for a lot of people because they have this mindset. This is the way we've always done it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, blah, blah, blah. If you're going to do this work and you need something to measure high risk, you have to have a risk assessment. So I use this next slide as kind of a visual on what it's like to implement change. And this is the initial reaction. I will come out, and if I was training people on the lab or introducing them to the danger assessment or the DAIL or something like this, and I'm talking to advocates and I'm talking to police and all that, this is what I get right here. All right. Kid at the dentist, terrified, freaking out, even though it's going to be good for him. First of all, for the record, that is not my kid. Okay. I took that off the internet. All right. I will admit that right there. That is not my child, but they're freaking out. They're screaming, they're crying. They don't like it, and this guy's just checking the teeth. If you look closely, he's not even doing anything. He's just checking and make sure things are good. And he's still panic stricken. Now, this is the slide after we implement and we show them how to use it and we show them the benefits. Right there, they're excited. Wow, this is going to make our job easier. Wow, I can pull the yeses, and that's my probable cause for arrest or probable cause to get a protective order. We now know where our client or victim is at this particular point in time. We know exactly who we need to contact. We know exactly what we need to do with just this small piece of information to get a team activation. So what I'm basically advocating here is your risk assessments are the key to opening the door to creating stability with your high-risk IPV interventions. When we move forward, everything we do from the minute we get a team activation and we start working high-risk teams, it's going to be the risk assessment that's going to go into that keyhole and unlock that activation. So here is just a basic rundown of how your risk assessment would go through the life cycle. We are starting with the risk assessment, and we determine it's high risk, okay? Extreme danger, high danger, time to get the hell out of their danger, blah, blah, blah. We activate your IPV team, and that will consist typically, back when I was doing this, there was a coordinator, there was somebody from law enforcement, prosecutor, advocacy, CPS, APS. It could be somebody from probation and parole. Parole needs an E, sorry, I misspelled that. Nowadays, it's not uncommon to have an immigration specialist on your core member of a high-risk or IPV team. Somebody from pretrial services might be there as well. And we're all working together at the same time, doing the same thing to make some decisions. Afterwards, we go into some intervention planning. And our output is we start seeing things happen pretty quick. We start getting protective orders. We start getting shelter services if they need them, victims' compensations, and those paperwork starts to go into place. Trial preparation, hopefully there's someone there that can expedite getting these cases on the docket faster. Law enforcement's engaging in constant follow-up investigations. As many of you all know, if I'm the arresting officer and I go and put, this guy in jail or this girl in jail for, aggravated assault or pointing a firearm or attempted homicide, and they make bail or they make bond, we know that even though we have a protective order, we've told them specifically at arraignment not to contact the victim, over 90% of them will contact the victim from the jail phones. Get this, that in big letters in front of the phone says all calls are recorded, or as soon as they get out and their feet hit the pavement outside the jail, that they're contacting the victim, either themselves directly or through a third party. So may have a violation of a protective order. We have harassment, we have stalking, we have terroristic threat or whatever. So we know immediately within the first 48 to 96 hours, we will expect another police call or another series of law enforcement calls, which in my opinion would require additional risk assessments right then and there, going back and attaching to the initial one the first time we made the arrest. We also have to consider civil issues. We have to think about immigration, child custody, property issues. So all of that is our output. And then looking forward at the disposition here, we're looking at, was the case accepted? Was it a plea bargain? Did they get jail time? Did they get prison time? The protective order, it went from a temporary to a 2-year to a lifetime protective order. And then ongoing counseling. There could be trauma, emotional, psychological, or even physical, that requires physical therapy or outside therapy or some kind of trauma-based therapy for your client. So this is like the basic model of the life of the risk assessment. And of course, you guys in the space, and everyone in here, when I say you guys, sorry, but ladies and gentlemen in the space, we're talking about, this goes on for months and sometimes years, but this is the basic model of how our teams activate, or how the risk assessment is going to work its way through the entire process. So what I'm suggesting here is that we take, instead of the organizational approach, we take a look at a systems model approach of moving forward on the basis of focusing on the risk assessments. And when we talk about building your IPV, and more importantly, sustaining it, we have to first realize that when you take a systems approach, it is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. In other words, the same thing you did for one case will not apply to all of your cases. And I know this sounds simplistic, but I promise you, the longer you stay in a job, and please feel free to agree with me on this, we get used to routine. We get used to doing things the same way every day for efficiency, or out of complacency, or we're just burned out and tired and we need to retire or find another job. But we try to basically pigeonhole everything into the same way of doing it every time. We get a case, we investigate it, we move it on to this person, we move it on to that person. And at the macro level, it may seem that way. But at the micro level, you've got different clients needing different things, needing different intervention, different pieces. That's those microcosms are the ones we really need to be focusing on. So going back to my original argument at the beginning of this presentation, was that the risk assessment is the foundation of this system. The risk assessment right there, whether it's the DALE, the ODARA, the danger assessment, the LAB, the MAC, the MARCS, or the MAC, whatever you're going to use, that is going to basically set the entire tone for that particular case, for that particular client, for that particular team activation. Now, team members consist of those working on cases. And what I mean by that is, there have been times where I've been out training and working with people or consulting, or asked to come in and look at a problem, where I would meet the core team, and that would be a coordinator, that would be the detective, the prosecutor that works, domestic violence cases and stuff like that. I would not need to see, say, the chief of police or the sheriff or something like that, unless they were directly involved in that case. Now, I love the fact that they had oversight. I love the fact that they were getting buy-in and they were, being the cheerleaders for the program. But you really want to be focusing on those team members who are going to basically be reviewing those risk assessments, engaging or activating those risk assessments in the field, and bringing them back to your IPV coordinator or team. Now, the mission is to provide safety for the client and hold offenders accountable to the highest degree by law. And that still hasn't changed. I think for us in this space, what the risk assessment does is it provides a roadmap, or the first step towards victim safety and holding offenders accountable. And when we have multiple risk assessments that we can show a jury, where we can see the continued pattern of scores varying, but not too much, but we show that it's the same common denominators of the same actor and the same victim time and time again. And we've got, instead of one, we've got 20 or 30 risk assessments, and we put them in a packet and we give it to a prosecutor, and then we show all of them at trial. Then we can really much say that this person is being terrorized to the point of near death, either verbally or literally, depending on the situation, by an offender who will not quit. And that's why this team was activated. And this is why all these mechanisms activated and fell into place. So when you're going to start building your IPV, and more importantly, trying to sustain it, number one is we have to decide what your overall mission is going to be. All right. And when we start writing mission statements, a lot of people have given me a page, or given me a couple sentences. And really, it's more content-based. What are you going to do with this team? How is the risk assessment going to help? And what are you going to do when the risk assessment's activated? All right. So my first question when we're starting this, or we're looking at rebuilding or sustaining it, is what is the number or score on a particular risk assessment that you have personally adopted for your team or your IPV, needed for IPV activation? And y'all feel free to throw that in the chat and Lacey can read it off to me. But is it a minimum score? Is it an average score? Is it just they're in extreme danger? They're in severe danger. An officer just came to us and it's an attempted murder, and that automatically triggers IPV response. But what is it? What is the I guess the average or constant that activates your team that based from a risk assessment that would get you guys started? And then also in your minds, try to imagine what this process looks like from start to finish. All right. We know that, okay, we don't know who the victim is yet or the client, but once we have an officer go out, or we have a sheriff's deputy or a constable or somebody from the hotline or advocate, or sometimes I've actually had risk assessments come in from hospitals because they went to the ER and we had somebody in the hospital staff part of the core for our IPV that would start it and then call an officer in and they would finish it. We would get a lot of good details from there. Another thing too is how many in here, just off the top of your head, have received a risk assessment on, say, a Friday night, and it was pretty bad, and the client, went to the hospital, got released, or they were admitted, and we knew they were traumatized. We knew the physical injuries kind of superseded everything we needed to talk about in terms of the details of the risk assessment. But you went ahead and just did a bare bones risk assessment. And then after 3 or 4 days, and they've had a couple of sleep cycles and they've gotten to a safe place, you go back and do another risk assessment, and then you compare the answers, or you compare the yeses, and you see the differences and the similarities in those. All right. That in itself is very telling. And more importantly, when you're trying to sustain and build your IPV, or build and sustain your IPV, try to imagine what success looks like in your mind. What is a successful program, a successful program where you use a risk assessment from start to finish? What does that look like? Is it the conviction? Is it the high bail amount? Is it the victim receiving compensation or being able to move away and restart his or her life with the kids? Is it basically drawing down or reducing the number of high lethality or high risk cases in your community? But what essentially does success look like? And you need to be thinking about that, not after the fact, but early on during when you're trying to sustain this program. All right, we're going to talk about more about success towards the end of this. The next section I want to talk about is when I was talking about grabbing all those risk assessments, you want to work on the law of averages with the risk assessment. And what I mean by that is if you've got 20 or 30 risk assessments with different scores, ultimately in your IPV, when you're working with this client, you want to have a running average where it's been consistently extreme danger. It's been consistently an 18. It's been consistently a 24. It's been an 11 on the lab. It's been a 13 here. It's been, the highest of scores. And then a couple days, months or days later, it may be a little lower or it could be higher, but you want to have a running number with an average of what it is you're dealing with that'll keep them in that high risk IPV category. And basically, let it be known to law enforcement and first responders when they go out, because this client of who she is and where she is and the fact that we're working with her, the expectation is we get a risk assessment and a report each and every time. So at the end, I didn't mean to click on that so early, but now that I'm here, I'll do it. This is what it should look like. These are all the calls for a client, and this is these scores, and this is where they said yes to these things. And this is just a snapshot of it. But this is you running those averages and keeping a tally until it goes to trial. All right. It seems like a lot of work, but after a while, here's the thing. I teach college now. You already have the answers to the test. All right. And I've never thought I'd say that to a student, but you want to keep an average of these scores or categories throughout the entire process. So from like day 1 to day 50 or day 100 or 180, you should be having these scores in here. You should have your own metric that determines high risk, okay, and why this case is so critical. So in this next slide, I'm going to give you an example here of a case I had a long time ago, and I totally changed the dates and all that and did some messing with it. So there's no confidentiality or HIPAA violations here. But this is kind of what it would look like in my mind. And I'm all about graphs. I'm a visual person. I like to read a lot, but I'm more of a visual person. And I'm going to give you another slide where it makes more sense here. But from like July 2022 to January 2023, there were 8 risk assessments. And the subtopics that are out to the right or the left at the very end, the tails, those were the ones that had high lethality. So I'll give you an example right here on the right side. And I want y'all to be impressed with my way I do graphics here because I'm still learning how to do all this stuff. A lot of it's YouTube and Google. But in July of 2022, on that first risk assessment or first RA, they reported aggravated assault. They were strangled. They received threats of death. And the suspect used a firearm during the commission of the offense. A month later, there were 2 more risk assessments. Okay, there was a violation of protective order, suicidal threats from the suspect. Again, committed assaults on the victim. There was alcohol involved, ongoing stalking, and the victim reported that she was pregnant. September 2022, the 4th risk assessment, we went to sexual assault. And during the course of that investigation, not only was she sexually assaulted, there was firearm, there was a report of stalking. He made homicide threats and then assaulted the victim in a separate incident. During the 5th risk assessment in October of 2022, there was an assault. There was a case of stalking. There was child abuse, which activated Child Protective Services and some of the other child-related crimes against children components in this IPV. And then he resisted arrest. He either ran, fled, or fought the police officers at the time of the arrest. Going a month later to the other side, at the bottom we have in November, we had the 6th risk assessment. Oops, sorry, I just lost my chin. We had the 6th risk assessment. And during that time, the initial report was assault, but upon further investigation, he made a threat to kill the victim and maybe himself, engaged in ongoing stalking. He committed arson at this time. He tried to burn the house down. There was a protective order in place, which was violated. And then when the police got there, he resisted arrest. In December 2022, the 7th risk assessment that they found, again, assault was the culprit, but they found alcohol, firearm, strangulation. And then the following year, January 2023, during that 8th risk assessment, we had threats to harm the child. It was a custody issue, threats to harm the victim, and strangulation. So all of this essentially would be in the packet. This would basically keep the story going of what was happening each and every time we interacted with our client or victim. And this is why it's critical to have not just one, but multiple risk assessments going, because this basically tells us in our organization or our IPV program how we're going to basically interact, what we need to do, what pieces we need to move or put in, or what gaps we need to fill to keep our victim safe, and then ultimately build a case to keep our suspect accountable for his or her actions. Now, the next one is a little scale I made when we're using multiple risk assessments tool. It's going to teeter back and forth, okay? It will go from some danger on one side to extreme danger on the other if you're using the danger assessment. If there's a numeric scale, it may go down to a 2 or a 3 one day, and then the next week or the next incident can go to an 18 or a 20. It's going to go back and forth. What I'm interested in is keeping it centered as much as possible. So when we average all of those scores up, we get a complete sense of exactly what was going on with our victim throughout the entire process when they were basically involved with the IPV. Questions so far? Are there any questions? I know I'm moving kind of quick here.
No questions. Just a couple comments. When you were asking about like what was the predictor of getting a victim involved with the high-risk team, someone said a combination of factors. Another comment, if a person calls for assistance, it should all be addressed, started, and it is not finished until the patient or client is safe and secure long-term, and that success is what the patient client says it is. And someone is impressed by your graphics.
Oh, thank you. Good. I'm available for children's parties too. I think Jennifer raised her hand. Jennifer, wait. Oh, more people are raising their hands.
I will unmute Jennifer. Hold on one second.
And you'll have to understand, I can't see y'all. I just see my beautiful face and the presentation. So I just have to rely on Lacey.
There you go, Jennifer. Did you have a comment?
I can't hear her.
Yeah, I think she's still muted. Maybe it was an accident.
Okay, it's fine. Well, we'll keep moving, and then at the end we'll have time for Q&A. We can open the floodgates for everybody. So moving forward with the next is just how do we gather that intelligence?
Real quick, David,
Yeah.
Someone asked on your graphic that they're shocked that there are that many incidents and risk assessments and that the perpetrator was able to continue to terrorize the victim. Can you speak to the outcome of that case?
Yeah, well, the outcome was he was jumping around counties. He bonded out, and this was a collection of different, like 2 counties, a couple smaller police departments. I'm sorry, I should have opened with that. And it wasn't until like the very end that when we started putting all these pieces together, all this crap was going on. And that's where it actually kind of leads into sharing information, because just to show of hands in here again, how many guys work with multiple organizations, like different various police departments and government agencies, where all of a sudden you find out that, okay, we think everything's going here, and then someone does a cannonball in your pond and say, oh crap, he showed up at her work, or he pointed a gun at her, and it just wasn't in your jurisdiction. You're sharing, they're working in one jurisdiction or hiding out another jurisdiction, and he found her in that jurisdiction, and that agency isn't even aware that your IPV is even involved.
Yep, lots of yeses. And then someone mentioned different states as well.
Oh yeah, totally different states. So we're gonna talk about how we gather that information next and share it. And again, I'm showing you a way, not the way. So don't say, well, Dave Scott said this, you're wrong. It's more like, for me, it's been trial and error. Okay. Even though we have text and we have emails, and we give the victim a crime victim's card, and we give her all this stuff, or him stuff. And I know I'm being generalizing this, but that doesn't mean all the information is going to flow. It's not going to be a smooth river from point A to point B. So when we talk about gathering that information, a lot of the stuff is just information we're pulling from the scene from officers, and that is the risk assessments. My other one is following up with the client frequently. All right. If it's a daily thing, I've had domestic violence high-risk team coordinators that had to call their clients on a daily basis because the risk was so high, and when the lethality was just so abundantly evident. We checked on them on an everyday basis, and within a moment's notice, if he was going by the house or driving by or showed up at work, the next call was to 911, and we had officers rocket there to try to intercept and get them or arrest them or do whatever. Each call to 911 or a hotline, of course, we always advocate a risk assessment and report, even if it's an information report, even if it's a risk assessment where they don't answer any questions or just check off 2 or 3 boxes. I still want it in that case, because what we can show at trial is that even though nothing overtly was threatening on that particular day, he is still hassling the hell out of her, or she is still hassling him, or vice versa. So we need to be thinking more broadly instead of just picking that low-hanging fruit, which is the aggravated, the firearm, the near-death experiences. I want the entire tree. I want the entire forest in this packet. Information is immediately relayed to the IPV, meaning that when something happens, we shouldn't be playing snail mail, phone tag. We shouldn't be saying, well, it's Friday, it's 5:01, I'll call them Monday. No. This has to happen now. It has to happen in real time. And the decisions that we're making are fluid. And what I mean by that is that what we're doing today is going to be totally different if something changes tomorrow. Or let's say the client decides he or she doesn't want to do something, even though we're trying to give them informed choices and saying, hey, this is why we're telling you or suggesting this because of A, B, and C, but they're still stuck on A. They can't get past A. Well, we're going to have to make more decisions. We're going to have to help them make decisions and come up with contingency plans. The next part we talk about is sharing the intelligence. And earlier I talked about who needs to know information and why, and who should be involved at the decision-making with your IPV, with the risk assessments. Again, all I care about is the access is needed for those working directly on the case. All right. And those are not my fingerprints, by the way. I have a program where I stole those too. I would be curious to see whose they are. If anyone works for APHIS here, that'd be cool. But long story short, I should see law enforcement. I should see the detective. I should see the coordinator. I should see that prosecutor, that advocate. These are the ones that are going to basically be running the machine. These are the ones that are pushing the buttons, pulling the levers, making decisions to see what services are available, to keep in contact with our client or victim, the ones that are basically keeping them safe throughout the entire process. Those are the ones that need to be at the core of these decisions. These individuals are the ones that are sustaining this program, the sustaining the need for an IPV intervention in all your communities. These are the ones that are behind the curtain working the magic. So a couple of things that I see about sharing intelligence or sharing of intelligence when they're trying to gather it is, does everyone have full access? And one of the things I absolutely dreaded when I would set this up is compartmentalization or decompartmentalization of information. I had one coordinator that I was training that had to learn basically a dozen different computer systems because no one was operating on the same system. I mean, the police had theirs, the sheriffs had theirs. I had two prosecutors that were running their own. A constable had his. And I really thought, okay, we have the perfect person here to help do this job, and we're about to lose her because she doesn't have a cybersecurity or a computer science degree here, because she has to go in and learn all these systems and how to access it. And my other question is full access. All right. When we talk about confidentiality and privilege, especially in the state of Texas, there has to be a number of releases signed by all members of the team, through the victim, through the advocate, to basically even hear the story, to get information, to have access to the client. A lot of these things have to be thought of, and those mechanisms need to be put up front early on before we start worrying about risk assessments, and how not only do we have a risk assessment, but how are we going to access and get full information about this case, and how do we share that information so we can make informed decisions. Are the risk assessments and reports being shared, and are they being shared in a timely manner? How quickly is that information being sent out to the right people? How quickly does the team even react to it? I mean, a lot of people have this 8 to 5 mindset where, okay, well, it's Friday or it's Christmas, surely nothing bad's going to happen during Christmas holidays, which everyone in this space knows that's not the case. But we have to be making, decisions on the fly. We have to be thinking, 2 steps ahead all the time when we're working in this particular area. And then who's going to be the keeper of that information? How are we going to store information? How are we going to keep it secure? How are we going to be able to upload and make informed decisions? Is it on a server? Is it in a file drawer? Is it on someone's desk, and so forth like that? Those are all questions we need to be thinking about early on when we talk about not only building, but sustaining the information and the intelligence gathering for your clients.
Hey, David, we have a question.
Sure.
So someone said that I've started trying to do something strategically with the data we collect from our risk assessments to show patterns and track case outcomes, et cetera. But I feel like most of our CCR team members aren't interested. It feels like they kind of treat the risk assessment as just a box to check when it comes to responding to these cases, rather than using them to inform our response as a system. Do you have any advice for how I can break through that and get greater buy-in? It's strange to me because I'm a law enforcement-based advocate, and it's community-based nonprofit advocates who seem resistant.
I think I wish I could say, yes, here's the answer, without knowing the temperature and who the players are in your jurisdiction. Fundamentally, it's about setting up a sense of urgency of why this matters and why it's important. And sometimes it's a matter of taking all the risk assessments and saying, okay, you guys are doing all this work. Here's your score. This is how dangerous these cases are. This is what's happening. We want to get out in front of this before we have a homicide or a murder or suicide. We want to, and sometimes it's basically, I don't want to say scaring the hell out of people, but it's basically shaking them out of complacency. It's, because this is the way we've always done it mentality, or, hey, we tried this in the past, it didn't work, so we went back to just doing this. It's sometimes maybe having individual conversations with those key players and saying, hey, this is why we're doing this. This is why I need you to listen to me. And this is the buy-in I just need from you. Sometimes it's just streamlining memos of understanding. So everyone understands their roles and their limitations to an IPV or to implementing a risk assessment. At the end of this, and I don't know who asked that question, you'll have my contact information. Tell me more about this and let's collaborate, because I'll give you everything I have that, the good, the bad, and the ugly of times we've had that resistance. We've had people push back or try not to get on board. And then later on, they ultimately did. Just sometimes it was for political reasons. Sometimes it was just the fact that this was the right thing to do and we're trying to save someone's life. Sometimes it was just they didn't fully understand the dynamics or what they were committing to, or they simply just, they were afraid or they had limited resources or they felt that they couldn't contribute. So sometimes there's more to it than just the simple no and slamming the door in your face. But yeah, at the end of this, please feel free to contact me and I'll get you whatever you need and we can find time and we can connect virtually and you can walk me through it a little more in detail. So the other question I had was the sharing of intelligence. This may play into what was just asked of me, is how are we communicating? Emails are great. But how many of you guys in here, honestly, you get an email from someone and you just don't open it or you put it on the back burner, because it's just, you don't have the brain space or the patience to do it. Phone tag. I have an office phone, and in the last 6 months, my office phone has rang 5 times because no one calls me at the office. It's either an email or a text. Texting is great because texting is instantaneous, and you can put a title on the who's sending it. You could put, your IPV team, you can put your DVHRT, you could put, family violence high priority, and you can read the text. And immediately you can send that out as many members as you want, and that information gets out, and you can do high priority alerts on those texts, which is basically the same thing. A lot of people say, well, how do you keep from getting spoofed? How do you keep your message secure? How do you know that the person sending the message is actually that person? A lot of people are now going to secured servers with two-factor authentication for members in particular teams. If they're sharing information, say on a server or in the cloud or through a text, sometimes they have to basically type in a PIN number and then call a number, and they have to say, yep, it's me, and gain access. If any of you works in the university setting or with anything that's like duo factor, for example, they're actually doing that a lot just to maintain the integrity of their information about their clients on their IPVs. And that's just another way to keep sustainability going. That way you don't lose any data, or no one gets in there and maliciously starts hacking or destroying or pulling apart files. Now, we talked about gathering and sharing. Now, I want to talk about briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, is acting on the intelligence. Okay. So in other words, what are we doing with this? All right, we have a risk assessment. It's extreme danger. The police have been there. The advocate's been called. They don't want to go to the shelter. They went to the hospital. In other words, we have this information. What do we do with it, and where are we going to go with it? One of the things we look at during the course of a case, again, is how many risk assessments are we doing with a client? And my answer to that is every time you interact with them, there needs to be some kind of assessment or information report asking those questions, to just basically figure out where they are today, not where they've been, not where they were a week ago, but where they are today, and to see if anything significant has changed or altered the status quo with the services the IPV is providing. It is not a one and done for the IPV with the risk assessments. There needs to be several. There should be a pre and post risk assessments being done with IPV activation. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, we have officers show up one night at a house or one afternoon or something, or at work, and we start asking questions, and they're embarrassed, they're tired, they're traumatized, they don't trust the police. Keep that risk assessment, even though nothing was said on it, and then go back a couple of days later when they're, had a chance to calm down, get medical help, sleep a few times, get in a safe place, and compare the two. Put that in the packet, get that to the prosecutor. Okay, that can all be explained by an expert witness in court if and when this case goes to trial with all these risk assessments. Our team members conducting an RA risk assessment each time. Find out. If they're not, get them to do it. And that would include a dispatch. That would include the hotline, medical, probation, parole. That would include prosecutors, and anyone that's going to basically have interaction with that client, and they know this client exists and they're high risk. There needs to be a paper trail somewhere. So other things we look at, what is the risk assessment telling the IPV? Well, that things are bad for the client. How bad? Now we have a number. Now we have a region, or we have a section that says, dangerous, really bad, totally dangerous, extremely bad, and homicidal. Is it time to get a protective order if there's not one already in place? Is there time to basically shelter or apply for shelter protection? Is it time to expedite the trial or hold the offender with no bail or high bail or high bond, getting him a GPS tracker, basically, doing all those cool things we talk about because of these scores. That's why we want to use that information. It doesn't just sit with the committee or sit with the organization. It needs to be used at pretrial. It needs to be used at arraignment. It needs to be used for a protective order. It needs to be used for extra patrol for the officers, both at home and work if possible. So this next slide here, I kind of made a matrix. And if I actually had access to the program, these little lines light up. But what I did here, and this was just another example, was I show you how all of these things, I attempt to show you how all these things connect. But at the center of it, you've got your victim. And then on the bottom right, you've got your first assessment. And you can see how all these offenses connect in some form or fashion. And then on the outside of the rim, you've got the types of things that occur that the folks are reporting on. You've got assault, jealousy, choking, or which is strangulation, pregnancy, suicidal, harm a child. And then you look at how they're basically being moved in there. That pregnancy was a result of forced sex, suicidal forced sex. The choking was after they were strangled, engaged in forced sex, jealousy, forced sex. When you go to the second one at the top of the bottom, you look at harassment and you see how all these things connect. When you're able to pull all of these risk assessments, you can start connecting these dots and you get a total picture of exactly what the suspect was doing, how they were doing it reportedly from the victim. And you start to put all these pieces together to show what a really, truly horrific person this person is, not just to the team, but you use that as the foundation to say, all right, we found one now. Now we need to find the other 6,000 we don't know about. And you work that into your sustainability piece, but you also keep that for trial. You also keep it to basically use it as training tools to say this all connects, this all makes sense. And then as we start to build and start getting buy-in from outside community members and people from different organizations to either verbally support, financially support, or help get you the resources you need, you can say, when we do all these risk assessments and we're asking all these questions, this is finally how all these dots connect. And this is what we're looking at the macro level when we're trying to keep a victim safe. Now, this all leads up to the next slide, which is sustainment. All right, and we're talking about sustainment with the IPV. Again, we want to adopt and implement your risk assessment early on. Again, that risk assessment can be anything. It can be the danger, the Dale, it can be the LAP, the ODARA, or the 100 other ones that are out there. You need to find something that's going to fit I always like to say, the theme of your community or jurisdiction, something that you all can agree upon, and then implement it, get training on it, and then put it to work. You want to train everybody, it's supposed to come on, there we go, on how to properly use the risk assessment. Simply grabbing it and starting asking questions and checking yeses is not sufficient. All right, you need to learn the method to the madness and why those questions are there. And more importantly, why those questions were worded the way they were and why they're in a particular order and how much weight that question has when you're adding everything up. Let's see. You want to review and study the responses as they come in. Okay, last week, she was never strangled. Now this week, she's checking off strangulation, which would indicate high lethality, or the suspect is basically moving up a degree towards homicide. There was no stalking, now there's stalking. There was no arson, now there's arson. He's never once made an outcry for child custody or trying to hurt the children. Now this is showing up on the radar. All right. All of these are basically, to me, I like using the word radar. These are things that show up as blips on the radar that we need to start thinking about and coming up with contingency plans. You also want to create the high risk threshold for IPV. In other words, what is going to be your number, your metric for basically saying high lethality that warrants an IPV response? All right. Now, the way we do it today could be different 6 months from now. That number could go up, it could go down, and that's going to change over time. It's not going to be static forever. But you start today, let's say it's a 10 or a 12, whatever. I'm just arbitrarily pulling out numbers here. Let's just say it's an 18, for argument, because we used that example earlier. All right, it's 16. And everything below a 16 goes through the run-of-the-mill law enforcement. They get their crime victims card, they go to the DA. But for these high-risk cases, that's a team activation. And every time we do it, we get the team activated and things start working, then we're basically able to show that we had 600 cases in this year, all high risk. And these were the outcomes. We saw an increase in bail. We saw an increase in protective orders. We saw an increase in police response. We saw more plea agreements going through the DA's office. We saw more lifetime protective orders. Those outputs is what's going to feed back in to your sustainability argument with your organization. It's going to be the risk assessments that are going to be those checks. They're going to show that here's the problem. They checked off on the risk assessment. This is how we responded to it. And that is going to feed into your sustainability. How are we collaborating also with other victims? I mean, other members of our organization. Are we sharing the information? Are we sharing it timely? Is everyone doing their job? Does the left hand know what the right hand's doing? Now, when we do all of this right, we're good to go. We're solid. My next question that comes up is, why do you think IPV high-risk interventions fail? Throw some comments up there real quick. Why are we failing? Why are these things folding? What's going on? There's 100 reasons. There's not one right reason because everyone's different. But why do you think these things are going sideways on us?
We do have a couple of questions after this.
Okay.
Someone said turnover, lack of resources. A couple of folks said lack of resources,
Okay. Those are all correct answers.
lack of coordination, overloaded on cases, money,
Okay. And we're going to talk about those.
family court giving custody to abusers so victims are unable to escape.
There you go. Well, the first and foremost thing you talked about was money. All right. Whether you're grant funded or you get money put aside, grants are basically seed money. And a lot of people think, oh, we got a grant, we're going to be forever. In my other presentations, I always have a picture of Stephen Covey, who came up with the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And his most, at least in my mind, his most famous quote was begin with the end in mind. In other words, if you're building this without the money, what would it look like? How would you sustain it? Because the money's eventually going to run out. All right. We're not going to have money forever. The other one is, does the mission statement make sense? Everyone on your team here has got a different mission inside their organization. Is everyone going in the right directions? When you look at probation, they may be going one way, advocacy going another, prosecution maybe going in separate directions, depending if it's a trial case, a plea agreement, if it's going to be probation or something like that. The police have their job. The courts, they separate. You might have like a criminal trial going for the criminal offenses. And like you just mentioned, with child custody, there's a civil component right there. And then we have medical at the very end. So again, we want to make sure that, everyone on this team, at least generally the mission, in order to continue and create sustainment, that we're all of us are going in the same direction. We may get there differently. We may have different micro agendas or small objectives that change, but fundamentally our care and concern is for that client and her children or his children and keeping them alive. Another one I just heard, which was a great one, was our members rotating off or leaving the team early on. Turnover rate. Okay. I can tell you right now that across the nation, and this is no surprise, we have a shortage of officers. All right. We can't put enough officers on the streets. And if we don't have enough officers on the streets, we surely can't put enough on an IPV team or put them in a detective, because we need most of these guys answering calls before they can ascend up to specialty types of investigations and stuff like that.
Well, in a lot of rural communities too, they don't have those specialty units.
There's
We'll
not.
only have a couple. Yeah.
We
You
have
want
the
some
one.
questions now, or are you gonna hold off?
Give me about 5 minutes and
Sure.
then we'll start hitting questions.
Sounds good.
The other one we talked about is there's no sense of urgency from core members. Going back to that question, I think Jennifer asked me, getting other people involved. Is the urgency or the emergency getting out to the people? And not only is it getting out, are they receiving it? Do they feel like it's a sense of emergency for us to allocate resources or people? Another one is decompartmentalization among members. In other words, we're not sharing the information or the proverbial, we're throwing people under the bus. I know that's kind of a graphic picture. I don't know why I picked that, but I did. Another one is meeting infrequently, or not at all. How many guys in here go to meetings where the whole thing could have been summed up in an email? Like every hand up here probably went up twice. I love this quote. This meeting could have been an email, and then someone behind him says, well, don't forget to send out the minutes. I mean, I've been in those meetings. There's no agenda. We're just in there. We're talking about cases, the whatever. Everyone's worried about getting their free sandwich or free food and all that. And it's an hour to 90 minutes where when you look back, what was accomplished? So, you want to have someone who can set an agenda. You want to make sure these meetings are productive. We're talking about old cases. We're talking about new cases. And what are we doing forward to do things better? We talk about an absence of clear definition of high risk. I'm almost done here. I promise I'll start answering questions. I found the definition of high risk right here. If you ever go back, just open the dictionary or Google it. There's your high risk definition. Likely to result in failure, harm, or injury, having a lot of risk, more likely than others to get a particular disease, condition, or injury. That's where you start right there. We also need to talk about what happens when we miss something. All right. This was a case recently out of San Antonio. I was actually interviewed by the San Antonio Express about it. And the thing I take from it is the team learns from the missteps. Not all the good stuff we did, but some of the mistakes and some of the times we missed it. We can do everything right, but tragic things are still going to happen. Another one is we have an arrest made here. This was a DVHRT high risk. They used risk assessments. Everything was done right. So my question is why are we not celebrating our victories? We need to take a victory lap on your teams. That builds morale. That also enhances the sustaining or the stability of the team, because we acknowledge that we did everything right and we had a positive outcome. And we want a lot of those. That's the good thing about that. One thing that a lot of organizations fall short on is getting the word out. A lot of people, I mean, I've literally been in these areas, and some of them were major cities and some of them were rural areas too. When I went out there and I would go to like these meetings and I would talk to the city councilmen, I talked to elected officials, they had no idea that they had a CCR or a DVHRT or an IPV. They're like, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. You know, I wish I'd known. I would have given them more money. I would have given them more resources. Well, it's up to us to get the word out. So when we have a good victory, we make a solid arrest, we get a good bond, we get a lifetime sentence, we get a protective order. You know, there needs to be some kind of something that gets out that lets the people know that, number one, your team is existing, you know, that, you know, you're using a risk assessment, why you're using the risk assessment, and that provides more confidence and a relationship with your constituents and people in your community that are going to really support this program. And don't just get stuck here. You have to understand social media. All right. Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, LinkedIn, whatever you're doing with your team, and with, you know, go through your department's policies, your organizational policies. What can you release to the public? Like, hey, our team made this arrest. Here's what happened. Blah, blah, blah. You know, we've made X amount of arrests. We found so many high risk cases. We've seen, you know, bond and bail amounts go from nothing to like 500,000 to $1 million, depending on the circumstances. We've seen a decrease in these reports. We've seen an increase in protective orders. We're working hand in hand with law enforcement and our judges. In other words, become the cheerleader for your IPV. That will help with the stability. Looking forward in the future, other types of questions that we need to consider: what else are we missing from our risk assessments? Is what about dating violence with juveniles and adolescents? Having a risk assessment just for them in high school and middle school. Cyber crimes, we're talking about revenge porn, sextortion cases. Maybe that needs to be a question. More detailed questions about being strangled or choked. Financial crimes. And, you know, what else could you think about putting on there? Those are questions we need to be thinking about in the future, and how it's going to impact your clients, and, you know, how those would constitute high risk or risk on your risk assessments. All right. My second to last slide is this: why we do this right here. I love this picture. Okay. I saw it. I forget, I think it was on Facebook or something. And it really, in my mind, symbolizes why we do what we do. Okay, this is just a picture of a tree. It's no magic, I promise. I'm not here to trick you. But outside, it was falling apart. It was rotting. But inside, the whole time, you had a sturdy trunk, a new tree growing from within it. And I think this is really symbolic of the work we do, because when they come to us, they're that outside, rotted, tore up, about to fall over, giving up on hope type of tree. And then when we get in there and we really start nurturing and we start working with them and we start helping them, you see the life that comes out outside of it or inside of it. And then it kind of blows the outside husk out and really gives them hope and gives them a chance to branch out and new life and stuff like that. All right. So now we'll get into questions. Right here, this is my contact information at the University of Texas at Tyler. That is my email address. That is my office number. I tell you the best way to get a hold of me is just send me an email, please. My office number is great, but sometimes the phone calls don't go directly to my cell phone. But I always check my messages. If there's anything I can help you with, if there's anything I can answer or provide training, some of you guys in Chicago, I saw y'all. I was up at the End Violence Against Women's International Conference this year. I saw some of y'all at the Crimes Against Women's Conference earlier this year. And if you were there, I do apologize. I do have a voice. I know when I was presenting, I had laryngitis or whatever. It was really bad and struggling. And the fact that I'm in this space here shows that there's redemption for me. So it's been great. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen now? Or?
You can if you want.
All right, let me do that. And I will stop share. And here I am. So there were questions.
Yes. So one is when our community was trained on the LAP several years ago, there was concern it would be included in discovery and used against the victim in trial. We are a large urban community. Are there suggested risk assessments for purposes of criminal justice response only?
Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that because of Brady. And in Texas, we have the Michael Morton law, which made basically put Brady on steroids. Discovery is absolute. Whatever we do on one side, we have to do on the other. I would contact your prosecutor. I would contact your state bar association and run it up their flagpole to see if you're missing something or if there's something we could do to avoid that information from falling into the wrong hands. That's the best advice I could give you right now. I don't. Are you in Texas? Are they in Texas or?
Was an anonymous
Okay.
attendee.
Yeah, I would contact your state bar or your district attorney counties association. We have TDCA in Texas, but something similar like that in your state, and pose the question to them and let them do the research and then hopefully get back to you pretty quick.
Great. And then someone said, since coercive control has been found by research to be present in 99% of DV homicides, do you recommend a particular risk assessment to detect a pattern of coercive control?
I don't recommend a particular risk assessment because a lot of them, they ask questions like, following you, stalking you, jealousy, stuff like that. I think it would go back to training, actually having those officers ask those specific questions at the scene, or having the advocate ask those questions and then sharing that information with the team would probably be the best way to do it.
Yeah, I know the Family Justice Center I worked at before, we utilized the abusive behavior inventory, which is a lot more lengthy and it's not necessarily a risk assessment for lethality, but does go into a lot more on the emotional abuse and verbal abuse and coercive control tactics, if that's helpful. And then in the chat, we had someone ask about what the Michael Morton law is.
I'm assuming that person's not from Texas, but the short story is the Innocence Project exonerated Michael Morton for a murder he didn't commit. He spent 25 years in prison. I've actually had the opportunity of meeting him and seeing him speak several times. Michael Morton, basically, the evidence was basically hidden from discovery. And that's just a very small summarization of what happened there. There was a travesty of justice in that case. There was a lot of things that were done that in no way should have ever been done by the prosecuting side of it. But the short story was he was exonerated, and upon closer examination, evidence that probably would not have convicted him was dismissed for whatever reason. So now basically in the state of Texas, all information, no matter what it is, if it's an information report, it's a piece of paper, scrap of paper, whatever, it is submitted as evidence and it is shared with the during full discovery. In other words, there's no surprises on either the defense or the prosecution side. Oh, you're muted. Lacey, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thanks for sharing your contact information. And he really, I promise, knowing David for a little bit, does not mind if you reach out. He really enjoys, I venture to say enjoys that kind of stuff. So don't hesitate. All right, really quickly, want to share a couple of other opportunities for you to attend some training. We are excited to announce our third annual virtual conference on October 2nd and 3rd. This year, we're partnering with the Rural Justice Collaborative to highlight the specific needs of survivors experiencing substance use and intimate partner violence. Registration is open now at that QR code. It's $100 for 2 days. And we will have CEUs available, or we have a group discount, 5 or more, it's $75 for 2 days. Got some great content. Mark Wynn will be presenting. The Stalking Resource Center will be presenting. We have some great national level speakers that are going to be involved. So please join us for that. And then finally, the RFPs are open for big conference, which is going to be May 20th through the 23rd in Dallas. You can access the submission link on our website under the speaker tab or by scanning the QR code. And the RFP should be open through the end of this summer, I think through the end of September, actually. So Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. A survey will populate in your browser. Please take a few minutes to complete it in order to receive your certificate. And the survey link will also be sent in a follow-up email. A recording of today's presentation and handouts will be available on the ICCR website by the end of the week. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks. Thanks, David.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.